Great. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Today is our latest installment of the Health Equity Speaker Series. These monthly events are where we turn to the experts in the global health equity movement, particularly the leaders who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as their expertise and contributions are most often systemically overlooked. As an organization, GlobeMed aims to mobilize a community of students and grassroots leaders to improve the health of people around the world. GlobeMed students learn about health equity leadership directly from the experts, our grassroots partners in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and become a part of the movement for global health equity. We also believe in the power of the community behind this movement, which is why we make these programs available to everyone. Additionally, these programs are possible because of the generous support of the community. We'll drop a donation link in the chat for you to also invest in this programming. So my name is Christine Bedenis. My pronouns are they, them, and she, her, and I'm the Communications and Development Manager at GlobeMed headquarters. And joining us today and to talk with us today is Joe Saucedo. So I will let Joe introduce himself in the chat. And if you have any questions, feel free to pop it in the chat, DM it to myself or India, and we'll wait until the end when we'll have time for audience Q&A or maybe earlier, depending on how the vibe of the event goes. So over to you, Joe.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you, Christine. And thanks, folks, for joining us, whether you're joining here live synchronously or watching this after the recording or watching the recording. Thank you for making the time. I'm Joe Saucedo. Pronouns are he, him, and ed. And I'm here from Skokie, which is a northern suburb of Chicago. So happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation to join you all for this health equity speaker series. And I've appreciated just learning more about, I was familiar with GlobeMed during the time that I worked at Loyola University Chicago, and that I'll speak on that in a moment. But I was definitely happy and thrilled to be invited to speak and sort of share a little bit of what I know. Certainly I've got some insights and content that I'd like to share with you all as it relates to all things equity and inclusion and diversity and belonging. But certainly I always arrive at these sort of forums in a position of learning myself. So there's some slides that I've put together with some materials, content, hopefully some resources that you might be able to, refer to in your own practice of inclusion and belonging. But certainly I welcome any, resources from you all, and, we can turn the slides down and just engage in a dialogue too. So just know that my intention here is to get to know you all as well. So yeah, in the chat again, let us know who you are, where you're joining from. But the focus really of my presentation here for today is about understanding practices, and specifically for me, anytime I think about inclusion, diversity, equity, these terms, as you might know, have been sort of tossed around as of late, and often can get misconstrued even, and I'll speak on that from my own experience. But I thought, this work is truly about, the way I see it at least, is about changing hearts and minds, right? In terms of, sort of transforming the ways in which we have come to learn about things, and sort of, being humble enough to understand what we may not know, and being also ready to learn from others and learn about ourselves in the process. So in the process of me, being an educator of social justice, and being an advocate or an aspiring advocate for justice, specifically in education, and even in my own personal life, I've learned that there's a lot of unlearning that I have to do. So there's a lot of things, messages that I had access to from a very young age and up until college even. And so I'll speak on some of those lessons that I learned and who sort of taught that to me. But in the process of trying to do better and be a better human being, as I like to say, there's a lot of unlearning that I have to do as well. So hopefully folks can relate to some of that. Next slide. But before we get into it, for all of you who are students, really all of us, I think, deserve some accolades for just surviving. I know me personally, the word of the last couple of years is survival. I'm a parent to 3 kids under the age of 8. And so we've got a 9-month-old, a 3-year-old, and a 7-month-old. So a lot of times I'm just trying to get through the day and make sure that we're all accounted for and alive and well. And so, but many of you are students. Some of you work directly with students. Some of you are at, institutions, higher ed institutions, and certainly the staff at GlobeMed do a lot of, I would call, God's work. And so there's a lot going on. And so I just wanted to acknowledge, congrats on surviving and being here and continuing to survive this pandemic, because we're not on the other side just yet. So just want to acknowledge that. Next slide. If we can go to the next slide, I'll come back to my story here in a moment, but I wanted to just start things off by understanding, and creating some space for you all to think about, what or who, in your life has kept you grounded, whatever that might mean for you. And this, for me, the question stems from just sort of in the busyness of the day today, in the journey, through a pandemic right now, and all that, all the challenges that come from something like this, from racial injustices to other forms of injustice. What keeps you, or who keeps you grounded and centered? And so I'm just going to pause and just let you consider. I'll read this. The slide says, in the context of managing stress from your studies, from your work, or life events, whatever that might be, what practices have you found to be helpful? And then who have you leaned on for support, if you've leaned on somebody or some persons for support? So I'll give you a moment to just think about that. And then I invite you to submit that in the chat. So again, thanks to everybody who's here. Lorena from Peru, great to see you. Patrick, I know we go back working at Loyola together, and so great to always share space with you. Siobhan, if I'm saying that correct, or Siobhan from Cincinnati. I'm sorry?
It's Shivani.
Shivani, hey Shivani, great to see you. Thank you for joining us from Cincinnati.
Happy to be here.
And Molly from Columbus. Terrific. And I've got family members in Dayton and Columbus, so I'm familiar with Ohio, though I'm born and raised Texas, South Texan, so I'll get into that, but so great to see you all. So if you're cool with me reading this, and thank you again for sharing and chatting. So Shivani writes, I've leaned heavily on my roommate, as talking and spending time with her is a way for us to share our day, our thoughts and experiences. Her insight is so valuable to me and grounding. Thank you, Shivani. And so I'm happy that you've got your roommate that you can also, connect with in this way and lean on for support. Patrick writes, getting outdoors and into nature. Amen to that. The idea that imagination always works best in the collective, leaning on colleagues, friends, and family. Most definitely. Thank you for sharing. And Lorena, I have found helpful to exercise, knit, and be outdoors. Definitely. I lean on friends mostly. Absolutely. I appreciate it. I'm actually learning from you all, and what you're writing is a reminder to also, lean on my friends and my support system. I'll add, a practice. So I've been very fortunate. I'm privileged to have a job where I can work remotely, and I've been doing that since March of 2020, before much of the U.S. had to be in lockdown and shelter in place. And so we have had the opportunities, my staff and I, to come back into Chicago downtown to work, but by and large, a lot of our work can be done remotely. And so I've been able to do that. And for me, I think I've been more mindful, at least in the last 12 months, to do some form of exercise, whether that's going to the gym, which is like 5 minutes down the street, during my, lunch break. Time is sort of fluid for me right now, but yeah, I try to just do some sort of exercise that keeps me grounded, centered, and gives me a chance to clear my head, as well as do something that is going to nurture my body. So again, whatever it is for you, I continue to encourage you to do it. Next slide, or if we can go back to the previous slide. So I just wanted to give you some backstory and a little background. This is not my complete story, but this will give you some insight into how it is that I do the work that I do. So I certainly approach diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging from the perspective of an educator. Most formally, that's what I've been doing for the last almost 15 years now. And so I'll say where I'm from, San Antonio. I'm a proud native of San Antonio, Texas. Which, you know, in terms of my ethnicity and race, it's a very salient part of who I am and my family. I'm Mexican American, third generation, meaning that my grandparents were born in the States. Well, 3 out of 4 grandparents were born in the States. One immigrated from Mexico. But I think that's always interesting for a couple reasons. First, just given the incredible history behind, you know, borders and how, you know, Texas was part of Mexico before it became, you know, a part of the United States. And also the fact that I'm a first generation college graduate. So in my family, at least, it took 2 generations before we had college graduates in the family, right? And so I definitely applaud, you know, folks who are, you know, first generation immigrants who are able to then, you know, find their way into getting their college education. But for us, I know it took us an extra generation. And I think I'll get into some of those barriers that can also, you know, sort of, interfere with success right off the bat. But I'm nonetheless proud, yeah, Mexican American, Spanish bilingual. I'm a career switcher. So I think I feel like nowadays it's pretty common to find people who pivot, I guess, and make the switch from one career to another. And I think there used to be more of a stigma around doing that. But, you know, I did that, I would say 15 years ago is where I realized that I wanted to spend my time working in a position that allowed me to use all of my gifts and really passion and purpose is what stood out in how I determined what I wanted to do. And so far, it hasn't let me down. In terms of family, I'm married, been married for 10 years now, and we have 3 sons and 2 dogs, and they keep me busy. and for anyone out there who has pets, I gotta say pets are the best. We had our dogs before our boys, and they are just tremendous and, you know, require a lot of good attention, but they give that unconditional love that I think has helped me through this pandemic too. So for me, again, passion is important. And I originally wrote passionate about, you know, advancing equity, but for me, that seemed a little too simplistic. And what I really am passionate about is making sure that the people that I come into contact with, whether that's in my professional life, my personal life, in my volunteer work, in community service, that I'm in a position that is going to ensure others are reaching their full potential, whatever that might mean for them. So that's how I usually make sense of what it is that I'm passionate about. Next couple slides, please. Awesome. So actually, I'll pause if there's any questions, comments related to that. And again, I'm loving the affirmation. Thank you, Lorena. And if anybody else has any, you know, feel free to do that. So lessons that I learned growing up, and I'm a very visual person, so I try to find pictures to also help me tell these stories. But I wanted to just share with you some of the lessons growing up. I kind of shared, you know, where I grew up, a little bit about my family background. I'll say one of the lessons that I look back and think about that I learned from my family, my parents, who worked for so many years. Just to give you some perspective, my mom worked right out of high school at the same company. She worked for 43 years before she retired. And I feel like that's unheard of nowadays, to stay at an organization company that long, but she was at an insurance company for that long. And it played a big role, I think, in just seeing my mom as a working woman, you know, without a college degree, to be able to help support us financially and all the ways that she has, I think was tremendous. My dad didn't go to college either. And he worked actually at a supermarket, a popular supermarket chain back in Texas. But he's been at the same company for about 40 years and still working. So and he's been working through the pandemic as an essential worker. Though I wish he would retire because there's just a lot of fears and anxiety that I have just for him. But hey, he's doing his thing, and I think from both of them as parents who are working. My grandma, who's featured here, she passed away 12 years ago now, and one of the favorite things that she liked to do was make tamales, especially in the holiday season. For us, it was, I was born and raised Catholic, and we celebrated Christmas. And so a big tradition was that we would have homemade tamales. You might see them there. They're wrapped in masa, corn husk, and they have filling. Usually it was pork, beans, cheese, whatever was around. But she loved to make that. That was a big part of her tradition. And so I'll say, if you work hard enough, you can accomplish anything that you want, was a lesson that I think a lot of my family members modeled for me. Also, folks in the community that I grew up in. My parents live in the same house that I grew up in. And I will say it's a low income working class family. I mean, a community that I was part of, mostly African-American, Black, Latino, mostly immigrant now. Although things are changing, it's become a lot more, I would say, gentrified as of late. Crime was a big thing, still kind of is in the neighborhood that I grew up in. But I'll say, if you work hard enough, you can accomplish anything you want. I'm saying this is the lesson that I learned. I'm going to come back to it because there's some danger in believing that for face value, that anybody can just work hard enough and you'll achieve. Because I learned that that's not completely accurate. The other lesson was that knowledge gained through formal schooling is the only knowledge that has value, right? And so some of this I learned in very blatant ways through teachers and folks that I would come into contact with, maybe in my church or in my even part-time jobs when I was in high school, things that I was seeing on TV and consuming in the media. I think there was a lot of stock put into getting your degree. And even my family, I mean, they were like, look, we didn't go to college, but we're going to support you and your brother. I have a twin brother, by the way. So everything I did has been in partnership with my brother too, like going to college and, finding our way after. But I put a picture of my grandma here because she played a huge role, namely because she took care of me and my brother and siblings when we were young. She dropped out of school in the first grade. She, even though she was born in the States, she primarily spoke Spanish. And it's interesting because when I think growing up, we lived down the street. So I was always at her and my grandpa's house. And so until he passed away. And my grandmother, we had a deal where we would teach her English and then she would teach us Spanish. And that was neat, and on top of learning cultural traditions and learning how to live, learning how to clean house, learning how to survive, basically, she taught us those lessons. But I will never forget one of the most profound things she always told us in Spanish was that she didn't want us to be dumb like her. Like, she's like, mijos no sean burro como yo. Like, I didn't go to school. I dropped out because she had to go take care of her siblings and her mom and dad. And she worked at a very early age, cleaning houses and doing domestic work. She never learned to read and write. She was illiterate. And so the lesson that I learned from her directly was, and others, was that, the education that matters is the one that you get at school. Obviously, I learned more. I learned that that's not also completely accurate. So, and I'll explain in a moment why. My family, very religious. We grew up, my parents are devout Catholics. I was an altar boy going to church, whether I wanted to or not. we grew up. Now, I will say the lesson was very articulately explained to us that, prayer, faith, and unwavering belief in God is what it takes to be successful, right? To be a good person as well. And so, yes, I still believe that this to be true. At the same time, I've come to learn that, not being sort of mindful and respectful of other people's faith traditions and faith traditions or religious beliefs, that if I'm not opening my eyes to see where they're coming from, that this lesson on face value is not the truth. So, but definitely I consider myself a person of faith, though I don't always agree with institutionalized religion because we're human. But I do believe in the power of prayer and faith. The other point here is that we don't talk about Bruno. I don't know if there's any Disney Encanto lovers out there. I saw it, a few weeks ago with my family, and there's this song that gets stuck in your head. And I think for me, it's interesting because I've watched it on YouTube, just a few of the songs as well. And what this sort of translates for me is that, we don't share our family's business, right, with other people. There's, at least I've been raised in a family environment where we just don't even talk, even with amongst ourselves. We don't really acknowledge, that member of the family who's going through some stuff. And so I'll say I have an uncle Bruno, who lived with bipolar disorder for all of his adult life, from the time that he was 20, I want to say mid-20s, and he's now 63 years old. And much of his adult life, he was living in institutionalized state hospitals, and was really shunned from the family. And so I think it did a disservice to my family that we didn't talk about mental health, that we also didn't affirm or seek to understand the power of therapy and mental health services. And so, again, I know my story is not unique, but I am happy to see that there's less of a stigma nowadays towards seeking help and asking for help. So yeah, we don't talk about Bruno or share our family's business with other people, with outsiders. And so that was a lesson that I learned definitely from, a lot of people in my family. And then the other one, again, this is very simplistic, but boys wear blue, girls wear pink. I don't know if anybody else has heard that. I mentioned I'm a dad to 3 kids. I say boys, because I think in terms of biology, that's what they were assigned, male at birth. But that could change, and I'm willing to understand that and be on that journey if that is, if their gender identity doesn't align with their sex. I'm definitely, given my work in higher education and social justice, I've come to learn what that could be about. So yeah, boys wear blue. And it's funny, I found this picture of my younger siblings. They're twins as well. And they have blue, and my little brother's wearing a blue shirt and my sister's wearing pink. And when they were born, I was 14 at the time. So we kind of acted like uncles to them. They're now much older. But I remember thinking with my sister, she's the only girl of 4 boys. We really spoiled her and bought everything pink that we could. And that was cool. But that is not, sort of the way I'm raising my children. So yeah, the other picture there just on the side is Georgetown. So I went to Georgetown University. I left home to go to college. And so if anyone can relate to that story, there can be a lot of culture shock and dissonance in that, and sort of being away from the comforts of your own environment. And for some of us, it can be a great way to thrive. For some of us, I've learned that to get away from home or the comforts of what you've been accustomed to can really set us free in many ways. So that's just a little backstory. Next slide, please. So you know what? Let me pause here to hear from folks. Cool with us. Yeah, let me just create space if there's any questions, comments that anybody had about what I just shared. All right. And again, we'll keep this going, but I thought, before there's a slide coming after this that shares some of the lessons that I've actually learned in the workplace, meaning, I worked in marketing and advertising actually right out of college. I was on that path for a while. And then I switched over to work in education, working directly with students and ensuring students could achieve and graduate. And then also I learned about social justice in my graduate school program. And so there's content coming around what sort of lessons I was able to learn and unlearn through that process. But I thought, before we even begin going down that road, I don't know about you, but I think a lot of times language can get conflated and misconstrued. Like terms can be sort of thrown out there when in actuality, I might interpret diversity to mean one thing, for example, and you might interpret it to be something completely different. And that's important to note, because if we're not sort of operating from the same baseline level of understanding, then things could sort of be confusing. Harm can be done. Privilege can sort of get in the way of that as well. So anyways, just wanted to provide some foundation here. So I took this graphic. This comes from actually a equity consultant out of Canada, because often I think there's a lot of good research coming from all over the world, around understanding what inclusion is and what diversity, what are the benefits of, a diverse workforce or a diverse, organization, for example. But I don't know, I've noticed in my time working, I also work now at a nonprofit called the Partnership for College Completion. And what we've been doing is working with a cohort, an actual collective of 25 schools in Illinois. These are public and private colleges and universities. We've acknowledged that, historically, looking at the numbers don't lie, but the data that we've seen for our state is that for the students not graduating from a 4-year school or a 2-year school with their degree, more often than not, the students who are not graduating at the highest rates tend to be Black, African American, or Latino, Latinx, or they tend to also be dependent on Pell Grants. So often coming from under-resourced, low-income communities. So, and if you think about it, I mean, they've been historically excluded, from higher education, especially here in America. And we're working with this group, and I think even then our job is to understand and unpack with them, like, how can you, whether you're a college president or a professor or a mental health professional who's working at a college to support students, like, how can you keep at the forefront of your work this idea of equity? And I've come to realize that if we pretend that we all are using the same definition of equity, then we're going to come out with so many different outcomes, right? We're going to come up with so many different solutions that we think could work, but could lead to failure. So with us, I've learned it's important to establish that language foundation. So equity versus equality. And so what I liked about this graphic, first off, you might have seen a version of this. 12 years ago, saw a version of this that's all cartoon, and it looks like a baseball field. And there isn't a person in a wheelchair. Like here on this graphic, you can see 3 people from left to right. There's 3 panels. And the first panel on the left side says same treatment. And we see that there's some sort of a fence drawn in that prevents the soccer. It looks like soccer players on the field. And then you've got 3 people who are spectators watching. And the person on the left, who looks taller than the others, is standing on a crate. All of them look to have been provided a box or a crate to stand on. Well, the person in the middle is a little shorter, but can still see above the fence. And then the person on the far right is in a wheelchair, it looks like, so can't even step onto the box that was given to help them see over the fence. So it's the same treatment, meaning in my mind that's equality, right? If we're to give everybody the same resources, then that's what they did. But guess what? The person on the far right still can't see the game, so how does that equitable? In the middle, we see the drawing with the person who is in the middle, who is a little shorter than the person on the far left. The taller person gave the person to the right their box, so now they can actually both see above the barrier. And then it looks like on the far right, the person in the wheelchair has some assistance that allows them to barely see over the fence, which, if the goal is to have everybody watch this game, okay, in the middle we can see equity is that they can all see the game. But when we think about liberation and removing the barriers, the last panel shows us with the picture without the fence. So let's just take the barrier away, and now they all can see. So I like this visual. I like what it demonstrates. I also like that it diversifies what we mean by diversity, because I understand that when we talk about inclusion, it's not just about race and ethnicity. It's not about just one dimension of identity. It's about a lot of different dimensions that make us who we are. So anyway, next slide. I thought that was helpful to understand what we mean by equity. So keeping that in mind, some of the things that I've learned in the workplace, in my work in education, for starters, there's a danger in believing only a single story. Because I think, and there's a wonderful TED Talk that came out, I think, over 10 years ago now, by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who is a wonderful, remarkable author, social activist as well. But I think what I love about this TED Talk, explaining, the idea that if we go through life believing one story to be true about a category of people. Oh, thank you, Shivani, for sending that. I think a lot of us, myself, I used to be guilty of that, of believing only one story that I might have had access to. And then I sort of generalize a category of people. So case in point, I grew up really thinking that if you were brown, that all brown people were Mexican. I really thought that was true. And when I got to the East Coast, guess what? We're not all Mexican. Not all Latinos, Latinx people are Mexican. And it was such a eye-opening experience for me to come in contact with folks from all over the world, Latin America, South America, to be specific, and to understand that we're so complex as a people, and that's a beautiful thing. And even then, I can't possibly know everybody's story, but I really need to know that it's not fair to sort of subscribe to only one story. My job is really to understand that there are multiple stories, and how can we access and make available the beautiful, diverse stories that are out there about people. The other thing that I've learned about, and I'll tell you, this has been really hard and challenging for me, is so I told you a little bit about my backstory, where I grew up, how I grew up. And for me, it's so easy to lean on my marginalized identities. I think I've come to learn that that's true for a lot of us, that it's easy to focus on where we feel othered and excluded and marginalized as a people. And so for me, if we're talking about race, I consider myself a person of color. And it's easy to go there for me to talk about like where there's some harm that was done to me as a result, and then also where there's strength behind being a person of color. But I found it hard to reconcile with my privileges of being male, cisgender male, straight as well, heterosexual, to be Christian, and I will tell you, it took me those experiences where I was in the minority and learning, directly from friends and people that I came to work with and teach and trust. It was through their stories of pain and hardship and calling me out, calling me in, however you want to acknowledge that, to understand that I've got a lot of privileges, and sometimes those privileges can overshadow and serve to diminish folks who are, in minoritized backgrounds. So I have both privilege and marginalized identity. So how do I make sense of that? And so this point here that I wanted to make is that for those of us who carry those privileged identities, or if we're perceived to have some privilege too from other people, then how are we actually cashing in that currency? Because there's value in that. So how do we cash that in? What risks are we going to take in our everyday life in the service of others, so that because only there, by cashing in that currency, only in those instances can we actually make change happen. And I hope that makes sense, but if it doesn't, let me know. To that end, passing the mic, that was another important thing. I don't know about you, but I know I've always prided myself on trying to be someone who can, be of service to other people. I think that stems from my upbringing, my faith values. And then I went and worked at Loyola, which is a Jesuit university. I think a lot of the values from GlobeMed resonate here too, of like, we're trying to make the world a better place. And many of you who are maybe public health, aspiring medical or healthcare practitioners. I'm guessing that might hold true for you. But I'll tell you that I ran the danger risk of trying to save people. Like, I think I didn't use that language initially, but over time I've come to learn that in my journey of trying to help, there's other ways of helping people. And so for starters, stop talking and give the mic to those that have not been heard, seen, validated. And so understanding how important that is, that's something that I've had to learn through practice and continue to practice. And then the other thing is humility and vulnerability. Those are strengths, right? Like I was taught that, we don't talk about, the things that are troubling us or causing us hardship. We just keep that to ourselves and we just sort of move forward and move through it. And I've learned that no, it's a lot harder and it's not healthy to keep things to ourselves. And so as much as we can do this, please open up, seek help, seek assistance from others. And then also be humble to the things that we don't know. So that's kind of where I meant with the last lesson that I've learned. Next slide. So this deficit thinking, this is something that I've come to realize is prominent in so many aspects of our life. Like, it's not just relegated to education or to the healthcare field or to government institutions. I think there's a framework that I wanted to share with you all. You might know this already, but it comes from Professor Terry also, who was at University of California, Santa Barbara when she developed this, and she's now in Michigan, but she's studied this idea from a critical race theory lens. And I know how that's very contentious nowadays, especially in the US media right now. There's a lot of pushback on critical race theory. But I want to say that this framework that she came up with and developed over her research of particularly people of color, this is who she studied, and also folks who were first generation college students. She realized that there's a lot of deficits often put on these communities, right? Like, I myself growing up, there was a lot of negative, messaging around, hey, you come from this low income area, therefore you need all this help to catch up to your peers, right? And a lot of that can be detrimental to our psyche. It can cause a lot of harm to our ability to see ourselves as being worthy of success. And so she's like, she came to realize that there's so many different forms of strength and assets that communities of color in particular have. And whether they're valued or not, they are there, and we need to embrace them and celebrate them. And so, and bottom line, there's cultural wealth that communities of color have. And I would argue that other minoritized groups, right, whether you are from LGBTQIA plus communities, or if you are undocumented, for example, there are communities that are wealthy beyond our belief. And here's why. So the next slide, just quickly, and I don't want to spend too much time. I think you can all read this later, but the community cultural wealth has 6 specific forms of capital that Professor Yoso identified in the research. I'm just going to read them around the circle here, but we see aspirational capital. This is the assets that an individual might hold. It relates to maintaining hopes and dreams in the face of barriers. Often when we think about families, I mentioned my family who didn't go to college, my parents, but they still nonetheless, they held out hope that their kids and the next generation would be able to find success. And I think a lot of times there's power for our students who might be coming from minoritized groups to hold on to the ways in which their family has role modeled what holding hope, critical hope, I would say, argue is important. And so I think a lot of that can carry students through hardship, even whether that's in undergrad or medical school or what have you. Familial capital. I know a lot of times from experience, I felt like my parents couldn't relate. My grandparents certainly couldn't relate to what college was all about. So why bother telling them or trying to explain what I was learning and studying and things like that? I kind of sort of put up walls, as I went through college and even in my early career. And I felt like, wow, that if I only invited them in more, I think we would have a lot of great conversations. And so Professor Yoso argues that there's a lot of, colleges might only want to focus on the individual student and how to help them be successful when they're at their university. But how do we also invite in family members, immediate family, extended family, and then chosen family? For some, biological family can be very harmful and dangerous. So what about their chosen family that they've identified in school? How can we leverage those people as critical support systems? Social capital networks, this goes to how important it is to create those social networks to, help us stay in school or, seek out career role models, things like that. Navigational capital speaks to this idea of how are we resourceful? How might communities of color already be trained to, I would argue, hustle and find resources despite all of the barriers around them institutionally? Like, how are they able to, make a dollar go a long way? If you're from a low income community, how are you able to be really resourceful to survive and thrive? Resistant capital is really about activism and resisting the norms and resisting the white supremacy, culture that we have here. So how is us all collectively working together in sync to support an individual in a world that wasn't truly designed for them to succeed? Linguistic, finally, is the form of capital that's either, you've got a person knowing a language, multiple languages. It could also be different forms of a specific language. So learning how to code switch and fit into communities that maybe weren't designed for you, but you sort of figure out how to navigate that those spaces in a way that lets you, continue to find success. So I hope that made some sense. So yeah, we can just pause here. And I just wanted to get some thoughts and feedback, observations that you all might have regarding some of this content.
I noticed in the graphic here, there's also cultural capital with the arrows going in both directions. Is that what, can you share a bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you, Christine. Yeah, so the idea here is that all 6 of these forms of capital, we can look at them individually, but a lot of times, just as we might look at our own dimensions of identity, they're all sort of interconnected and working, simultaneously. Some might be sort of zoomed in based on the moment or the context, but collectively, these all working together are going to constitute somebody's cultural capital and, in effect, their wealth, right? And so I'll tell you that learning this when I was working at Loyola, learning about this research, we as a department, so I used to work at Student Diversity and Multicultural Affairs, our task was really large. Like, we essentially were working with anyone from a minoritized group. We operated our staff, very small staff, worked together as a safe haven. Oftentimes when they were confronted with bias or discrimination at the school, maybe it was in the classroom or in an internship office or whatever, or in the residence hall. But we often, if folks felt like, hey, I was just sort of biased against because of this or how I identify, they would seek our resources and support. And I'll say that this framework was really useful to help students, especially if they were maybe in their first year of school, where it can feel like, what the heck am I doing here? Like, this is another world if you're first generation even. And this framework just allowed people to feel like, okay, I've got family capital, I've got, aspirations, my parents do, even though they may not speak English well, but they want to understand what I'm doing here. I've got, navigational capital. It helped me in high school and now it's helping me here, or I was a transfer student, so this helped them to see that you can do this. Like, you're not lacking. You are not, despite popular messages out there, you bring so much, you have so many gifts and things to offer this community. And that's all part of inclusion, belonging, diversity. Like, it all sort of comes back to these sort of frameworks. Yeah. So I hope does that make sense? Or okay. Again, there's multiple frameworks, and this isn't the end all be all. I think there's the beauty of research and I consider myself to be a lifelong learner. And so I know that there's a lot more research that hasn't yet been done to unpack how organizations, whether you're a school or a hospital setting or a nonprofit, what does it mean to, pass the mic and allow your members of your community to tell you how they're really doing and feeling, and if they're feeling excluded, then that's on the hiring managers or the decision makers or the faculty to make it right. So yeah, other thoughts or feedback? All right. So hopefully, yeah, if you find this approach or framework helpful, I would, encourage you to read up on Yoso. And I can share with Christine in India, there is an article that goes into greater depth what Professor Yoso was researching. And I think she's also updated it since 2005 to add some more dimension to it. So, because again, a lot of this has to be done with careful nuance. I think that's important and critical of any researcher. So yeah, hopefully you can apply it in your school setting if you're at a university or college, or again, even in the workplace. Next slide. So other things that I've come to learn and appreciate, and this again, thank you, Lorena. Yes, decolonizing. Thank you for saying that. That's a term. A lot of this language I didn't have until I got to grad school, and that was only 11 years ago. But what I've come to learn from my students, former students, and because I don't work necessarily directly with students every day now, but with my colleagues, I, was very intentional about being understanding of where my teams were, especially if I was their supervisor. And I've come to realize how important it is for people to have the safety to be able to speak their truth, right? And I applaud and admire when I think about activism, and especially Black Lives Matter, folks behind that movement, who are taking real risks, right? Like for some of us, we're just sort of retweeting and it's safe to do it from afar. For others, they're putting their bodies and lives on the line to make change happen in big ways. And that's for a lot of communities over history, right? Not just present day. And so I think by and large, it's important to just, speak your truth. And then if you have privileges or you're in a position of power or privilege to do this, to create space create space for others to speak their truth. Because I think truth telling is really what leads to shifting of our hearts and our minds, shifting policies and institutions as well. And everybody at the end of the day has a story to tell, has a unique story to tell, but we can't do this in silos either, right? Like, so coalition building definitely is important. And I've seen there's so much evidence out there that supports the idea that, coalition building, interest convergence, usually that's another tactic or approach that has led to positive outcomes for marginalized groups, is that banding together as you're able to, but also being mindful of who was there, what power a community already holds to come up with solutions. So again, I hope you can see that a lot of this can apply to any field, whether it's public health or education or the private sector. And I don't think it's by accident that you see a lot of these private corporations trying to find DEI professionals. And I'm skeptical. I will say it's great on one hand, because it seems like, okay, they're trying to allocate resources and hire this talent, but it doesn't do the individuals who are hired any favors if they're expected to be the only person to care about diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. Like, it really has to be, it has to funnel through at all levels of an organization. Yeah. So next slide. So that's all I had for content. But I hope, yeah, I've appreciated just hearing from you who are with us now live. Again, I invite you to keep in touch. There's another slide, sorry, with just my contact information, but I will definitely, for India and Christine, I will send you the materials. There's an article again that supports the community cultural wealth framework. And yeah, I'm always learning and seeking to learn. So I thank you all. I applaud all of you in whatever it is that you decide to do, in terms of your career or studies. Um, know the power of community. I certainly value knowing that I'm not alone in doing this work. It can feel lonely to, push up against the status quo and push up against, institutions and people that really don't see the value in understanding people and understanding the power or the need to be inclusive. It can feel lonely and frustrating, but again, I continue to feel hopeful when I especially think about our young people leading the way in a lot of these revolutions. So thank you again for your time. I'll open up to questions, any comments that folks have.
I had a question come through as a DM from Priya, and she says she really loves how you have shared your story about the stories and lessons and experiences that have shaped you, and also the experiences that helped you to unravel and remake the stories and lessons to more deeply align with the values of inclusion and belonging. She thinks it's really important that we all do that for ourselves. And she's curious if you have any advice on how we can cultivate community spaces that allow for inclusion and belonging with diverse groups of people. So like, what should we do to create that space for ourselves and others on campus and other aspects of our life?
Yes, I appreciate definitely all of the affirming feedback and the question, because it's hard to do. The first thing is just embrace the fact that you're going to make mistakes. I think that's hard for a lot of us to, in our heart of hearts, we have nothing but good intentions, but despite that, we could still, offend or hurt somebody or overlook somebody, and that can feel bad. And so I just want to encourage folks to reflect on that and be okay with that, because again, change is hard work no matter what. The things I would say is you can do it digitally online. I think the benefits, while there's been so much hardship as a result of COVID-19 and other just forms of injustice that predate us even, I think that the benefit has been to see the power of technology, like being able to create digital spaces. So I used to be someone who thought that the only way to really truly connect with people is in person. I mean, yeah, there's truth to that, but I also recognize, especially, and I learned, especially in working with our LGBTQIA plus students at Loyola, there was a lot more safety in people connecting virtually because they may have not been out about their, sexual orientation, or they might be gender nonconforming and still haven't sort of reconciled that with their friends or close networks. So connecting virtually in a space online can do more to create safety than if they were in person, right? Gathering. Same could be said for undocumented communities, because that's a group that I got to work with very closely and still do. And there's a lot that I've learned even with my own citizenship privileges, and just things that I took for granted. I'm like, wow. So I would say virtual can be a great offering. The other thing that I've learned, Christine, too, is that, and I'm sure a lot of the colleagues here can relate, that I think you got to do the self-work first. So where I've seen sort of good intentions go awry is that we might be in a mixed company, meaning I was part of intergroup dialogues looking at race, ethnicity specifically. And if I was in community with colleagues, this was in the workplace, where some of my white colleagues would either do two things. Some of them would maybe try to dominate the conversation. Oftentimes it was white males. So there's white male patriarchy happening, that privilege playing out. But then there was white silence happening, and folks, and I'm thinking, what's that about? I'm over here, my colleague who's a Black woman is pouring herself out, or a Latina woman, and I'm like, what about why are you so quiet? We're not gonna get anywhere if not all of us are participating. That was just my reflection. But what I come to realize is that it can be scary to put yourself out there. And my advice is that if you hold privilege identity, it's not just for race, but let's say if you're in community trying to support folks who are neurodivergent or have some sort of disability, and you want to create inclusion there, but you yourself, I myself am able-bodied, able-minded right now. I need to like do my homework and understand, before I get into that space of trying to come up with solutions. I need to, honor where they're coming, or if not, I need to also create space for just that learning to happen. But then I also got to contend with my own forms of privileges. Does that resonate? I don't know. I think that's just for anybody to keep in mind.
Yeah, thank you for that advice and thoughts. And I see that Patrick has said, good to see and hear from you again, Joe. Thanks for all you do, especially appreciate these final points and reflections. So
Yeah.
Anybody else has anything they'd like to add into the chat or to unmute and ask Joe? We've got time for maybe one more question.
Yeah, what practices have you learned, or what advice might you give to, for example, if we have grow interns who are going abroad to be in different cultures and they encounter some practice of the organization that is inequitable, what are ways that they, being essentially like, guests in this place, can have conversations around something?
Yeah. I'm sorry, what's your name?
My name is Peter.
Peter, thank you for that question. I love that. I didn't share this in my story earlier, but I studied abroad as a junior, and I studied in Spain, Spanish-speaking country, but I had one of the worst times because there were people showed me their racism right on day one. The host mom was already saying things that were when you start a sentence like, I'm not a racist, but I'm like, okay. But I think there were projections about me because I was Mexican, proud Mexican, and I was already getting my Spanish critiqued by this Spanish person. But again, I was literally a guest in her house for 5 months. So I was like, well, I can't go anywhere else. Like, I gotta just sort of bite my tongue. For starters, I would say for anyone that you're working with in that capacity, you gotta create training ahead of time, like pre-departure, to sort of anticipate what could come up, because they might be, maybe not anticipating that things that negative things could happen. And I think they just have to be prepared with, should these sort of things happen, who can they turn to? So I think secondly, like creating a space for them to vent or share, in a safe way. How can they process what they're experiencing? I think that's for starters, with people that they can trust, and then second, I guess thirdly, would be to create some sort of a teachable moment. Like maybe it's, if the culture and the environment in which they're visiting and working in, is there a way to leverage your local contacts on the ground there to just sort of learn their history? Because the last thing you want to do is be this rude guest, who is trying to change a whole culture. That's not going to happen, right? Like, it's not going to work. So I think just sort of recognizing that this is the history, and creating a teachable moment. But again, last thing you want to do is subject an individual to a toxic, very unhealthy environment, right? Like if we're, and I'm not just talking about physical safety, mentally, emotionally, if they're under distress because they're around all these racists or whatever the case might be, then you got to think about, what steps can you take to protect your people. But yeah, that's a great question, I think. And I can even see that applying domestically too, like it might be, you don't have to leave the country to be surrounded by some hostile folks. And so how do you reconcile, what are some, how are you training them to have just, simple practices of reflection, of communicating openly, of being respectful of the culture that they're surrounded by or trying to support. I hope that helps. It's not easy by any means.
Thank you, Joe. And it looks like we are at our time for the hour. I hope everybody enjoyed hearing from Joe about inclusion and belonging. Thank you again so much for all of your insights and wisdom. Just as a reminder, the Health Equity Speaker Series is a monthly event, and you can find all of GlobeMed's upcoming programming on our community programming page on our website, which we'll link in the chat. And if you would like to invest in our ability to continue offering programming like this, we'll drop our donation link in the chat. And Joe had also shared his contact information with the slides. We can make sure that, well, that'll be, the recording will be up on our YouTube page. You can just fast forward to the end to find that as well. And so thank you again so much, everybody, for attending. And thank you, Joe, for joining us.
Thanks so much. And I hope you all have a great rest of your year. Okay.
Yeah, wonderful.
Right.
So see you all next time.